Hey everyone, tonight we're going somewhere, quiet, somewhere on the edge of medieval society, past the castle walls, beyond the tavern noise, and into the outskirts where nobody really wanted to live, but someone had to. So, dim your lights, get comfortable. Let's talk about one of history's least invited dinner guests, the medieval executioner, and more specifically, what happened after the chopping, hanging, and boiling stopped. What did life look like when the blade got dull, the hands got shaky, and the crowd stopped chanting their name? Because, spoiler alert, retirement for medieval executioners wasn't exactly filled with sunshine, warm porridge, and grandkids climbing on your knee. No, it was different, you see. Medieval towns had a funny way of treating their necessary evils. Executioners were, by all accounts, essential public servants. You needed someone to handle the punishment side of things, the unpleasant business of keeping order. But at the same time, they were considered spiritually radioactive. People feared them, avoided them. Sometimes, they literally lived outside the town gates because no one wanted to share a well with the guy who decapitated their cousin last spring. So, imagine doing that for decades, standing in the mud, swinging the sword, cleaning up the mess, and then one day, you're told, "All right, Hans, you're too old for this. We'll get someone else to swing from now on." And just like that, the town's most feared man became its most unwanted retiree. Now, it's not like they had pensions back then. No medieval HR department. No thanks for 30 years of loyal beheading service banquet. Retirement, for most executioners, wasn't planned. It just sort of happened when their hands shook too much to aim properly. Some got lucky and passed the job down to a son. The role often stayed in families, so the old man might hang around as an advisor or toolkeeper. But once that physical edge faded, their social isolation didn't. In fact, it got worse. Because when an executioner was in tea, actively serving the town, when he was in tea needed for a hanging, a flogging, or a branding, people didn't know what to do with him. Without the grim performance of public justice, he was just there, a reminder of mortality, sitting quietly in the corner of the tavern while everyone else pretended not to look. Let us drift for a moment into Germany, the land of bureaucratic efficiency, even before it had the term for it. Many medieval German towns actually recorded their executioners' contracts. Some even offered modest benefits, like housing or food allowances. But even so, these men were banned from joining most guilds. They couldn't be merchants, they couldn't be bakers, they couldn't even sell normal goods in the marketplace. So, how did they make ends meet? Well, let's just say retirement plans were creative. Some became healers. Yes, healers. The same hands that once swung the sword, now mixed herbs and stitched wounds. Sounds ironic, but it makes sense. Executioners knew anatomy better than most physicians. They had practical experience with the human body, often too much of it. Records from Nuremberg and Augsburg show retired executioners acting as unofficial surgeons or herbalists. People wouldn't shake their hand in public, but they'd quietly visit their homes at night for remedies. Broken bones, infections, childbirth complications. They treated it all. It's this strange duality that makes the medieval executioner so fascinating. Despised by day, depended on by night. Others turned to animal work. Because, again, nobody else wanted to touch things considered unclean. Executioners often doubled as knackers, the ones who disposed of dead animals. It was smelly, unpleasant work, but it was steady. Some collected hides and bones. Others provided dogs and horses to the town. A few even started side businesses producing tallow or leather, always on the edge of society. But always useful. You'll notice that word keeps coming up. Useful. That's the key to understanding these men. They existed in this bizarre space between respect and revulsion. The town needed them desperately, but wanted to forget them as soon as the job was done. And when retirement hit, that usefulness often became their only lifeline. Now, the irony deepens. Because despite the fear surrounding executioners, some actually became quite well off, especially in larger towns, where executions were frequent, or where the job came with additional duties, like torture, yes, that paid extra. A successful executioner could earn more than a blacksmith or carpenter. They often received housing, food allowances, and even tax exemptions. So, when retirement came, a few, just a few, lived relatively comfortably. They might own a bit of land, maybe a few animals, maybe even employ servants. But even with money, social acceptance never came. They were like medieval ghosts, physically present, socially invisible. There's one story I particularly like, or maybe like is the wrong word. It's telling. In 17th century France, there was an executioner named San. His family had been in the trade for generations. When he retired, the town allowed him to live in the same house, but required that he use a separate church entrance from everyone else. Imagine that. Decades of service, countless duties performed in the name of justice, and he still wasn't allowed to sit with the townspeople in prayer. That kind of sums up the whole executioner experience. Necessary, but never forgiven. In smaller towns, retirement often meant moving away altogether. Once someone else took over the role, there was only room for one official hangman. The old one became redundant. So, he might pack up what little he had, tools, maybe some herbs, a dog, and head to another region to work odd jobs. Sometimes, towns provided them with a modest stipend, a sort of hush payment to ensure they wouldn't wander around causing trouble or begging in public. Because, let's face it, no one wanted the former hangman hanging around the marketplace. It's amazing how, even in retirement, their lives were managed with this quiet, bureaucratic unease. Nobody wanted to deal with them, but everyone wanted them contained. You might wonder, did any of them ever get redemption? Did people ever stop seeing them as the executioner? There are rare cases, especially in later centuries, where executioners' descendants integrated back into society. By the 17th and 18th centuries, some towns relaxed restrictions, and families that had once been ostracized found new professions. But for the medieval generation, the ones who lived under church authority and superstition, the stain rarely washed off. They weren't buried in regular cemeteries. They weren't allowed to hold civic office. Their children often had to marry within other executioner or knacker families, because no one else would have them. It's a quiet, generational curse. And yet, there's a strange kind of dignity in it. These men lived on the margins, carried out brutal work, and still managed to build families, earn livings, and leave behind legacies, even if history barely remembered their names. When we picture the medieval world, we often imagine kings, knights, and peasants. But the executioner, the man who stood between law and chaos, lived an entire life in the shadows, performing one of the most morally ambiguous jobs imaginable, and then quietly fading away into anonymity. Some died alone, in poverty. Some became respected healers. A few, perhaps, found peace tending gardens on the outskirts of the village, enjoying the same quiet they had once denied others. So if you ever walk through an old European town and see a crooked little house near the wall, with herbs hanging by the window and a view overlooking the gallows hill, there is a good chance that where one of them ended up, living quietly, growing old, waiting for the world to forget his name. Because that's what really happened to most of them. They didn't burn out. They just, faded away. Hey again, if you're still here, that means you've fully settled into the soft hum of medieval misery, and you're probably wondering, alright, if these guys were shunned and avoided, how did they actually survive between jobs? Because, believe it or not, there weren't daily beheadings. Even the most dramatic medieval towns had quiet weeks. So, what did an executioner do when no one was being tortured, hanged, or drawn and quartered? Well, grab a blanket and get cozy, because this is where the story gets weird and a little entrepreneurial. So, picture this. You're an executioner in 14th century Europe. You have a small house near the town's edge. Nobody wants to talk to you unless, of course, they need something. And that's where you start to notice a pattern. Because it turns out, when you're already handling corpses, blood, and blades, you've got skills that can be useful elsewhere, like surgery, like dentistry, like barbering, and, occasionally, magical healing. The medieval hangman was often the closest thing many people had to a doctor. Let's start with surgery, because this one is both morbid and oddly practical. Executioners had to know where arteries ran. They had to understand how to dislocate limbs, sever tendons, and frankly, keep a person alive just long enough to make an example of them. So, when someone in town broke a bone, or when a wound festered, who do you think they called? Not the priest, not the apothecary. They'd sneak out at night and knock on the executioner's door, and he'd patch them up. Records from 16th century Nuremberg show that hangmen often carried small chests of medicinal herbs and ointments. Some were surprisingly sophisticated mixtures for swelling, poultices for infection, and even crude forms of anesthesia using wine and mandrake. And while townsfolk wouldn't speak to them in daylight, they'd whisper about the hangman's hand, supposedly imbued with strange power. In some regions, it was believed that touching an executioner's hand could cure warts or fever. You can see how messy things got when superstition and medicine collided. One moment he's cutting off limbs for punishment, the next he's sewing them back together for healing. Now, about that barbering, it might sound funny, but the barber-surgeon connection goes way back. Medieval barbers weren't just shaving faces, they were pulling teeth, lancing abscesses, and letting blood for humor balance. So, many executioners naturally slipped into that role. They already owned blades, they were already used to blood, and they had, let's call it, a steady hand. Imagine sitting in a chair while the same man who executed thieves last month gives you a trim and pulls your molar. You'd think that would be terrifying, right? But oddly enough, people trusted executioners for this because they knew how precise he could be. There's something almost poetic about that. The same edge that delivered death also offered relief. Now, let's talk about their most bizarre and lucrative side gig, collecting body parts. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval Europe, body parts were a hot commodity, not for decoration thankfully, but for medicine and magic. People genuinely believed that certain human remains, especially from executed criminals, contained healing or protective properties. Powdered skulls for headaches, strips of human fat for arthritis, even the gallows rope, thought to bring luck if tied around livestock. And who had easy access to all these materials? The executioner, for example. There is documentation from 17th century Germany showing hangmen selling mummy powder, a mix of ground human remains and herbs, at local markets. In England, gallows ropes were stolen or sold for good luck charms. Some hangmen grew quite rich from this side trade, though officially it was banned. Unofficially, everyone knew they might not want to dine with him, but the town's elite had no problem buying his, let's call them, products. It's one of history's great hypocrisies. Publicly condemn the hangman, privately knock on his door for a vial of powdered virtue. The irony is that many executioners became expert chemists and alchemists over time. Their access to materials gave them a grim kind of laboratory. They experimented with preservatives, unguents, even proto-antiseptics, and in a strange roundabout way, that knowledge passed into early medical science. So, in a very dark twist, the same men society feared may have accidentally advanced European medicine. But all this shadow work, the medicine, the barbering, the trading, didn't erase the stigma. Most executioners were still required to live separately. Their homes were often near gallows fields or pester houses, and their children were forbidden from marrying into other professions. In some towns, executioner families had to wear distinct clothing or markers, like certain colors or badges. They weren't allowed to eat in taverns or sit in church pews with others. Even their children inherited the label. Executioner's daughter was practically a curse, and marriage options were limited to the children of tanners, knackers, or other unclean trades. You can see how social isolation turned into generational exile. And yet, here's the strange part. Some of these families embraced it. The profession became hereditary, not just because no one else wanted it, but because it offered stability. In a world of unpredictable famine and plague, being an executioner guaranteed a house, food, and an income. For some, that was worth the social exile. So, father taught son taught grandson, and over time, they formed dynasties. The Sanson family in France, the Meister Franzlein in Nuremberg, the Ricard family in Bavaria. They passed down not only swords and ropes, but also secret recipes for medicine, salves and Y's poisons. One of the most famous was Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner from the late 1500s. He kept meticulous journals, and they read like a grim blend of surgical log and personal diary. Over his 40-year career, he executed 394 people, and healed just as many. After his retirement, he even received a special pardon from the emperor himself, allowing him to live as a citizen of honor. That was practically unheard of. But even then, most neighbors still avoided him. You can't wash off a lifetime of death with one royal signature. Let's pause for a moment here, because it's easy to look back at all this and think, wow, medieval people were superstitious and weird. But really, it's just another reflection of how societies compartmentalize their necessary evils. We need someone to clean the wound, and someone to cut the head, and often, it's the same person. The executioner was both healer and destroyer, public servant and pariah. His house was both feared and quietly visited. It's the kind of duality that still lingers today, just in different uniforms. So, when the executions stopped and retirement began, these men didn't simply vanish. They drifted into the edges, into medicine, crafts, and quiet survival. Their lives remind us that history isn't just made by kings and saints. Sometimes, it's held together by the people everyone else pretends not to see. And in the stillness of their twilight years, they likely preferred it that way. Hey, again, you're still here. That probably means the quiet hum of medieval despair has reached that perfect level of soothing monotony. So, let's keep floating. We've talked about the work, the stigma, and the strange side hustles of medieval executioners, but now, we drift into something almost cozy, a topic that shouldn't be cozy, but in a weird way, is because tonight, we're talking about executioner families. Generations of hangmen, passing down the blade like a family heirloom, with all the pride of a knightly lineage, just bloodier. Now, in most medieval towns, the executioner's position wasn't one people wanted. It was assigned, usually, as a punishment. You might have been a thief, or a soldier who messed up badly. The town spares your life. On one condition, you become their executioner, and if you refused, you'd probably be the next one on the block. So, that's how many of these family lines began. A condemned man choosing the axe over the noose. But once the job was his, it was his for life, and soon, it would belong to his sons too. By the 14th and 15th centuries, executioner dynasties had become an accepted part of the European justice system. In Germany, France, and even parts of Scandinavia, the job was hereditary, meaning, if your father was a hangman, congratulations, so are you. It wasn't just convenience, it was practicality. Your family already knew the procedures, the rituals, and the bureaucracy. You had the equipment, the uniforms, the connections, and let's be honest, nobody else wanted to touch the job. So, the hangman's sons trained from childhood. In some towns, the local government kept official apprenticeships. A boy might begin around age 10, learning how to sharpen blades, handle ropes, and manage prisoners. It sounds grim, but it was considered an education, just not the type you'd brag about at dinner. Executioners had manuals, too. Some families compiled their own grim handbooks, how to dismember cleanly, how to use different tools for different crimes, how to ensure a quick death when mercy was permitted. The goal was professionalism, because even in medieval justice, reputation mattered. A good executioner was one who didn't botch the job. A bad one could cause riots. The Meister Franz family of Nuremberg was one of the most famous examples. Franz Schmidt, the family's most well-known member, left behind detailed journals of his work, covering over 4 decades of executions. He began as an apprentice under his father, Heinrich Schmidt, who himself had been assigned the job as punishment for a minor crime. By the time Franz retired, the family had transformed a cursed legacy into something resembling respectability. He was known for his precision, calmness, and oddly, his compassion. His diaries describe prisoners he pitied, and the efforts he made to grant them dignity. He even became something of a minor celebrity for his medical skills, as we mentioned earlier. By the time Emperor Ferdinand granted him full citizenship, effectively erasing his unclean status, Franz was old, tired, and quietly proud. It had taken 2 generations to wash away a stain that started his punishment. Across Europe, similar families appeared. In France, the Sanson family dominated for nearly 2 centuries. They were the official royal executioners of Paris, which sounds like a dark joke, but it was a legitimate title. Charles Henry Sanson, perhaps the most famous, carried out the beheading of King Louis XVI in 1793. Imagine that, a man whose family was cursed to serve the monarchy, ending that monarchy with his own hands. History has a sense of irony, doesn't it? But not every executioner family had royal favor. Most were small-town men balancing the fine line between feared and necessary. They had to train their sons, not just in the technical parts of execution, but in social survival. How to walk through town without starting panic. How to handle drunks shouting insults. How to talk to clerics, nobles, and condemned prisoners, all in the same day. It was a delicate performance of calm detachment, one that, over generations, became second nature. Interestingly, these families developed their own culture. Executioners often married within their own circles, sometimes even across towns. A daughter of a hangman in Frankfurt might marry the son of one from Munich. It wasn't romantic so much as strategic. Only another executioner's family truly understood the isolation, the stigma. You could almost call it a secret fraternity. They wrote letters, exchanged tools, even borrowed one another's apprentices. And some of them grew wealthy doing it, because once you were established, the job paid well. Towns needed their hangman, and the families who could guarantee skill and discretion were in high demand. It's a grim kind of prestige, but prestige nonetheless. The Sansons, for example, lived in a comfortable Parisian house, dressed fashionably, and even dined with members of the aristocracy, albeit discreetly. The irony never faded, though. These were the same nobles who'd later line up under the Sanson blade during the Revolution. But most executioner dynasties weren't dining in palaces. They were scraping by in small towns, surviving on a mix of wages, tips, and those infamous side trades, medicine, charms, and bits of the gallows rope. Still, the profession offered something many medieval workers lacked: security. You'd never be unemployed. You'd never starve. Your children would always have a future, just maybe not one they'd have chosen. And when executioners did retire, it was usually into quiet obscurity. They might pass the job to a son or a nephew, and withdraw to a small cottage near the fields. Even then, most townsfolk avoided them. The taint didn't wash off easily. It clung to the family name for generations, even if no one in the line had executed anyone in years. In Nuremberg, descendants of hangmen were still restricted from holding office well into the 18th century. Some families moved towns entirely, changing their names to escape the association. It was the medieval version of witness protection, except the only thing you were running from was your reputation. But there's a strange dignity in their persistence. The hangman's trade wasn't about glory. It wasn't even about justice. Really, it was about continuity. About someone, anyone, doing the work that everyone else refused. And that's how executioner dynasties endured, quietly, grimly, and professionally. For centuries, while kings fell, empires changed, and revolutions burned, the hangman remained, always waiting, always ready, and, oddly enough, always necessary. You've stayed. That means you're ready for the last stretch, the quiet aftermath of a life lived on the margins of death. Because even executioners, eventually, put down the blade. And what happens next is strangely human. Let's start with something that's easy to forget. Executioners were civil servants. They drew salaries, took oaths, had contracts. They worked for towns, cities, or monarchs, which meant they could, in theory, retire. But retirement wasn't a clean break. The stain of the profession clung to them, like smoke in their clothes. Most couldn't simply walk away and live like ordinary men. They were still unclean, marked by decades of contact with death, legally, spiritually, and socially. Some tried to reinvent themselves, others simply vanished. Franz Schmidt, the meticulous, methodical hangman of Nuremberg, is one of the few we know who managed something close to redemption. After 45 years on the job, he retired in 1617. His record lists 361 executions and hundreds more floggings, brandings, and mutilations. But it also lists something else: hundreds of healing treatments. Because Franz was, in the strangest twist of fate, a healer. He used his anatomical knowledge and steady hands to treat injuries and illnesses, especially for the poor, who couldn't afford doctors. He made herbal salves, set broken bones, performed surgeries, and people came to him, quietly, at first, then openly. By the time he was old, he debuilt a small practice in Nuremberg, and earned enough goodwill that Emperor Ferdinand II granted him full citizenship, washing away his dishonorable status forever. He died peacefully, surrounded not by shame, but by patients who saw him as a man who spent a life balancing death with mercy. But Schmidt was an exception. Most executioners didn't get redemption arcs, they got solitude. The average hangman, after decades of service, retired with a modest pension, or with whatever savings he'd scraped together from side jobs. He might move to a small cottage outside town, near the woods or a stream. He might keep a few animals, grow herbs. He might still be called upon for the occasional grim task, an autopsy, a hanging, a medical consultation, but mostly, he waited for people to forget him. In many towns, though, they didn't. Children still whispered his name like a curse. Old women still crossed themselves when he passed. Even when he was old, bent and harmless, he carried the invisible mark of the gallows. Some spent their final years alone, others with family. But even then, the next generation often carried the burden of that legacy. In churchyards, executioners were sometimes buried in separate plots, away from respectable citizens. No grand headstones, no prayers, just a patch of earth. But not all endings were quiet. In France, the Sanson family, that dynasty of royal executioners, stayed in the profession for 6 generations. Charles Henry Sanson, the man who executed Louis XVI, retired in 1795. His grandson took over, then his great-grandson. But the revolution changed everything. What had once been a job of royal duty became a public spectacle. The guillotine became a national symbol, and the Sansons were its high priests. Crowds gathered not just to see justice, but to be entertained, to cheer, to watch. And when the terror finally ended, so did the family's dignity. By the mid-19th century, the Sanson name was synonymous, not with duty, but with death. They retired quietly, broke, and largely forgotten. There's a strange melancholy in that, how those who carried out the law were always denied the comfort of belonging to it. They lived between worlds, servants of order, yet exiled from it, necessary, yet unwanted. When they finally stepped away, there was no ceremony, no farewell, just silence. And maybe that's fitting, because if their lives were defined by noise, the jeers of the crowd, the clatter of chains, the crack of the scaffold, then perhaps the end they wanted most was peace. In the end, medieval executioners were neither villains nor heroes. They were functionaries in an age that demanded public justice, men who bore the burden that others refused to touch. They lived and died in shadow, but they kept the machinery of law turning. And sometimes, like Franz Schmidt, they even found a way to bring healing into a life built around death. Close your eyes again. The scaffold is gone. The crowd has dispersed. A man in plain clothes walks down an empty street, his tools packed away forever. For the first time in decades, his hands are clean. And that's the end of this story, the quiet exit of the medieval executioner. All right, settle back in. Let's not wake the cat, or your conscience. We've followed the executioner through his working years, through the jeers and the darkness, and finally into his lonely retirement. But the story doesn't stop when the blade is put away, because in Europe, the shadow of the executioner lived on, in folklore, superstition, and, weirdly enough, tourism. Yeah, tourism. After the Middle Ages ended, and modern justice systems began taking shape, towns that had once employed executioners found themselves with a problem. What do you do with the memory of the man who killed for a living? You can't really celebrate him. You also can't erase him. So they did what medieval towns did best. They turned him into a story. Take Germany, for instance. By the 18th century, people were already whispering legends about executioners' houses being haunted. It made sense. Those houses were always on the edge of town, literally on the border between the living and the condemned. People said strange lights floated around them at night. Dogs wouldn't go near. And if you knocked on the door after dark, the hangman's ghost might answer. The fact that the real executioners were often still alive inside those houses didn't seem to bother anyone. But legends have a way of mutating by the 19th century. When Romantic writers started digging into the Gothic, those decaying castles, tragic figures, and moral grey zones, the medieval hangman became a character archetype. He wasn't just a man with a job anymore. He was a symbol of fate, of guilt, of punishment that you could never quite escape. In French novels and German plays, executioners were suddenly tragic philosophers, men burdened with too much justice, doomed to loneliness by the sins of others. Basically, people started feeling bad for them. And that might be the strangest twist of all. There's also the small detail that many executioners' families stayed in the business for generations, like the Sansons in France, or the Reichardts in Bavaria. The Reichardt family, for instance, were executioners for 300 years, and their last descendant, Johann Reichard, was the official state executioner for Nazi Germany. Yes, the job lasted that long. And no, history doesn't let anyone walk away clean from that kind of continuity. After World War II, Johann was arrested, interrogated, and eventually released, because he'd only executed those the state told him to. But that logic didn't sit well with people anymore. He lived out the rest of his life in isolation, despised by a society that no longer wanted to remember the kind of justice he'd once served. He died in 1972. The line of Reichardt executioners ended with him. So, technically, the last medieval hangman survived into the 1970s. Let that sit for a second. But not all traces vanished. If you walk through certain German towns today, Nuremberg, Bamberg, Regensburg, you can still find the executioner's house. Some are now museums, others have plaques outside. Inside, there are displays of ropes, masks, branding irons, old ledgers, medical tools that look suspiciously like torture instruments. You can even see Franz Schmidt's journal, written in his neat, formal script. Every death, every injury, every healing recorded without emotion. It's the kind of thing that makes historians whisper, even when no one's around. What is strange is how many of these men, after all that public horror, ended up being remembered with a kind of quiet respect. Not admiration, exactly, but recognition. Because they weren't monsters. They were the necessary shadow of a world obsessed with visible justice. Without them, there was no closure, no moral order, no spectacle to remind everyone what law looked like. It's grimly poetic. In a way, they lived to enforce civilization, and were exiled from it for doing so. And yet, centuries later, they've become part of the same human story they once punctuated with death. They've turned into bedtime curiosities, museum exhibits, podcast episodes, and yes, sleepy YouTube monologues like this one. It's as if the world finally figured out what to do with them. Not punish, not praise, but study. So here's a final image to close your eyes on tonight. A quiet town at dusk. A cobblestone alley leading to a crooked old house. No crowd, no scaffold, no cries for justice. Just the faint smell of iron and herbs. A man sitting by the window, hands folded in his lap, watching the sun go down for the first time in peace. He's done his duty, and for once, no one's watching. And that's where we'll leave him, the medieval executioner, retired, remembered, and maybe, finally forgiven.